Your grandchildren tap this shape every single day, and they have no idea they're touching a ghost. It's the little save icon in their apps, a flat plastic square almost none of them have ever actually held. In a minute, you'll see a red plastic viewer you lifted toward the light, clicking through tiny three-dimensional worlds, 7 little scenes to a reel. And later, a heavy black rectangle that movie night was built around, with one unwritten rule that could cost you real money down at the video store. 25 objects your grandchildren probably couldn't name. Keep count of how many you can, and remember the one you know best.
Put a finger in a hole, pull the wheel all the way around to the stop, let it spin back, and only then reach for the next number. That's the rotary dial telephone, and it's become a genuine puzzle for young people. Videos of teenagers failing to dial one have gone viral for exactly this reason. For decades, it was the standard home phone, usually the one everyone in the family shared. It was tied to the wall by a coiled cord you stretched around a doorway. Touch tone, then cordless, then mobile phones ended it. A grandchild might not even realize the wheel is what you use to enter the number, and that missing step is the whole gap between the generations. Here's a thin, flat plastic square with a sliding metal shutter on one edge and a paper label across the front. That's the floppy disk, and here's the strange part. Your grandchildren probably see this shape every day and never know it, because it's still the save icon in countless programs. They tap it constantly without ever having held the real thing. Each disk stored only a tiny amount of data by today's standards, and you carried a stack of them to move files between computers. USB drives and the cloud made them obsolete, so the object vanished, but its picture lives on, quietly telling a whole generation to save their work. Here's a small rectangular case with 2 little wheels inside and a ribbon of thin brown tape running between them. That's the cassette tape, how a generation carried and recorded music. You slid it into a player, and the tape ran past a head that read the sound. To skip a song, you fast-forwarded and guessed. To copy music, you recorded it in real time off the radio. The catch, which a grandchild would never guess, is that the tape could spill out and tangle. That's where a common school supply rescue came in, which we'll get to. CDs, then digital files, replaced it. But the ritual of making a mixtape is something only the cassette generation truly understands. Here's exactly that rescue tool, and it looks completely ordinary. A simple wooden pencil, the kind still in every drawer, but show a grandchild how it was used with a cassette and they'd be baffled. When a tape came loose and spilled, you slid the pencil's 6-sided end into the toothed wheel of the cassette and turned it by hand, reeling the loose tape back inside without wasting player batteries. Every kid who owned tapes knew this trick without being taught. It's a tiny piece of everyday problem-solving that made perfect sense then and makes no sense at all now. The pencil survived. The reason you'd spin a cassette with it disappeared completely. Here's a heavy pot with a little glass knob on top. Set it on the stove and, in a few minutes, it bubbles and fills the house with the smell of coffee. That's the coffee percolator. Water climbs a center tube, rains back over the grounds, and cycles again while that glass knob slowly darkens, and you watch it to know when the coffee is ready. A grandchild raised on single-serve pods would have no idea this is a coffee maker at all. The automatic drip machine, especially Mr. Coffee in 1972, brewed without boiling the coffee bitter, and the percolator faded. But the sound and the smell are unforgettable to anyone who grew up around one. Here's a small handheld viewer shaped a bit like binoculars, with a slot on top and a lever on the side. Hold it up to a bright window and click the lever. That's the Viewmaster. Slide a round paper reel into the slot, look through the eyepieces, and you'd see a 3D photo. Then click the lever to advance to the next scene. 7 little views per reel. For children, it was a window into faraway places and cartoon stories, all in 3 dimensions, long before screens. A grandchild might mistake it for a toy camera or a pair of odd binoculars. Phones and tablets replaced it, but that click and the sudden pop of a 3D image is a childhood memory for many. Here's a small square that's snapped onto the top of a camera, with 4 little bulbs behind clear plastic, one facing each way. That's the flash cube. Before built-in electronic flashes, each indoor photo needed a fresh burst of light. This cube gave you 4 flashes, rotating a new bulb into place with each shot until all 4 were spent. Then you popped it off and pushed on another. Family gatherings meant a camera clicking and a cube flashing and rotating, and a little pile of used cubes by the end of the night. Electronic flashes and then digital cameras made them obsolete. A grandchild would never guess this tiny plastic cube was once how you lit up a photo. Here's a small bottle with a little brush in the cap, full of thick white liquid, sitting beside a typewriter. That's correction fluid, known by brand names like liquid paper and whiteout. Typewriters had no delete key. When you made a mistake, you brushed a thin coat of this white liquid over the wrong letter, blew on it to dry, and typed the correct one right on top. Whole offices depended on it, and the little bottles were everywhere on desks. Computers with a backspace key made fixing mistakes effortless and quiet. A grandchild who has only ever hit undo would have no idea why anyone needed to paint over their words to correct them. Here's a thin sheet of dark, inky paper that smudges your fingers just to touch it, sandwiched between two blank pages. That's carbon paper. Before copiers were everywhere, this was how you made a copy while you typed or wrote. The pressure pushed ink from the dark sheet onto the page beneath, producing an original and a duplicate at the same time. It's where the CC in email still comes from, short for carbon copy, a phrase your grandchildren use without knowing its origin. Photocopiers and computers made it obsolete. Show them the actual inky sheet and they'd never connect it to the little CC line they type every day. Here's a thin weekly booklet with tiny grids of times and channel names on every page, and a color cover of a television star. That's the TV guide. Before on-screen menus, this was how you knew what was on. You ran your finger down the column to find the 8 o'clock shows and planned your whole evening around it. Someone in the house usually guarded it like treasure, and it ended each week dog-eared and marked up. On-screen guides and streaming menus made it pointless. A grandchild who scrolls endless options on demand would struggle to imagine needing a printed book just to find out what was on tonight. Here's a thick, heavy book with tissue-thin pages, packed edge to edge with names, numbers, and addresses in tiny print. That's the phone book. To find anyone's number or any business in town, you looked it up here. It came free to every home once a year, so thick it doubled as a booster seat and a doorstop. The white pages listed people alphabetically. The yellow pages listed businesses. You kept it right by the phone. The internet and mobile phones made it obsolete, and the giant annual delivery stopped. A grandchild who just says a name to a voice assistant would find the idea of hunting through a book of strangers' numbers genuinely bizarre. Here's a small tool with a crank on the side and a rounded cup at the top, the kind of thing that lived in a kitchen drawer. Turn the crank and 2 whisks spin. That's the rotary egg beater. No electricity, just gears and your own arm, turning steadily to beat eggs or whipped cream. It sat in most kitchens beside the flour sifter and the potato masher. Making a cake meant real work, cranking until the batter was smooth. Electric mixers took over the job. A grandchild who's only seen a stand mixer might mistake this for some kind of old drill and would never expect to be the motor themselves. Here's a large, flat black rectangle, heavier than it looks, with a hinged flap on one end and a spool of tape sealed inside. That's the VHS tape. This is how families watched movies at home for years. You slid it into a VCR, the machine pulled the tape across a head, and the movie played on your television. There was one unwritten rule that a grandchild would find hilarious. Rewind it before you return it, or the video store charged you a fee. Streaming made all of it vanish, tapes, players, and video stores alike. The idea of a physical box you had to rewind and drive back to a shop belongs to a world they never saw. Here's a rack of folded paper maps at a gas station, free for the taking, while an attendant fills your tank and cleans your windshield. That's the fold-out road map. Before phones gave turn-by-turn directions, this was how you found your way. You spread it on your lap or the hood, traced the route with a finger, and refolded it, usually badly. The full-service station handed them out free, back when someone pumped your gas and checked your oil without being asked. The gas crisis ended the free maps, and GPS finished the job. A grandchild who's never known a wrong turn without a voice correcting them would be lost, literally, with only a paper map. Here's a small pocket radio with a dial and a speaker grill, often with a single earphone and a wrist strap. That's the transistor radio. It was how a generation carried music and news around, small enough for a shirt pocket, tuned to top 40 or the ball game. You may remember one earphone in, catching one more song after bedtime. But here's the gap. It only played whatever a station chose to broadcast right then, with no way to pick a song or skip an ad. A grandchild used to choosing any song instantly would find that lack of control almost unimaginable. Now look at the wall of this house. There's a small metal door built right into it, with a second little door on the inside. It isn't a mailbox and it isn't a vent. That's the milk chute, or milk door. Milk once arrived at the house from a delivery man who set glass bottles in the chute from outside, so the family could lift them out from inside, often before anyone was awake. Cold bottles waited there at breakfast, cream risen to the top, with empties and a note left out for the next round. Supermarkets and home refrigeration ended it. A grandchild would never guess this little door in an old wall once brought fresh milk to the house every morning. Here's a slim booklet in a vinyl cover, with a pen tucked in and a little register in the back full of handwritten entries. That's the checkbook. Before cards and taps, this was how people paid for most things. At the store, you'd write in the amount and date, sign it, and tear off the check while the line waited. Then you recorded it in the register to track your balance, since there was no app. A grandchild who taps a phone to pay would be amazed that people once stood at the register, writing out and signing a paper slip for a cart of groceries, and that everyone behind them simply waited. Look at the back wall of this old medicine cabinet. There's a thin slot cut into the metal, sometimes labeled razor blades. That's a razor blade slot, and it led straight into the hollow space inside the wall. Men shaved with double-edged safety razors, and dull blades were dangerous in the trash where children could find them. So you dropped each used blade through the slot, and it fell down between the studs, gone for good. Nobody ever emptied it. Cartridge and disposable razors ended loose blades. A grandchild would have no idea that decades of razor blades might be quietly piled up inside the walls of an old house. Getting a clear picture out of this often meant standing perfectly still, holding two thin metal rods at just the right angle, while everyone shouted, "There! Hold it right there." That's the television antenna, the tabletop rabbit ears, or the rooftop aerial. You angled and extended them for each channel, and wrapped the tips in foil when the picture rolled. This was how nearly every home received TV. Cable, then satellite, then digital changed it all. A grandchild with hundreds of crystal-clear streaming channels would be astonished that a fuzzy picture once depended on someone standing across the room, holding two metal rods perfectly still. Here's a smooth wooden shape, a bit like an egg, sometimes a mushroom with a handle. A grandchild would probably guess a toy. That's the darning egg. When a sock got a hole, you didn't throw it out, you mended it. You slipped the wooden egg inside to stretch the fabric taut, then wove thread across the hole until it was closed. It lived in the sewing basket, and darning was often an evening task by lamplight. Cheap, plentiful clothing made mending socks not worth the time. A grandchild raised to simply buy a new pack of socks would find the whole idea of repairing one, with a wooden egg, almost unthinkable. Here's a slim ceramic bottle with a sprinkler head on top, sometimes shaped like a cheerful little figure, standing next to an ironing board. That's the laundry sprinkler bottle. Before wash-and-wear fabrics and steam irons, cotton clothes needed dampening to iron out wrinkles. You'd shake water across a shirt, roll it up so the moisture spread, then press it smooth. Ironing was its own weekly ritual, with a basket of sprinkled, rolled clothes waiting beside the board. Steam irons and easy care fabrics made it unnecessary. A grandchild who's rarely seen anyone iron at all would never guess this little bottle was once an essential laundry tool. Here's a heavy machine on a desk with rows of number keys, a handle on the side, and a paper tape feeding out the top. This is not a typewriter. That's the adding machine. Before electronic calculators, offices and shops did their daily math on one. You punched in the figures, pulled the handle, and it printed each number and the total onto a paper tape you kept as a record. The clatter of keys and the ratchet of the handle were the sound of an office. Cheap electronic calculators, and then computers, made it obsolete. A grandchild with a calculator in their pocket would be puzzled by a whole machine and a roll of paper just to add up a column of numbers. Here's a low wooden cabinet, long and heavy, that looks like furniture. Lift the lid, though, and there's a turntable inside. That's the console stereo, or hi-fi cabinet, usually with an AM/FM radio and speakers built in, often the centerpiece of the living room. You stacked records on the spindle, and they dropped one at a time to play. On a slow Sunday, the whole room gathered around the sound from that cabinet. Component systems and portable audio made furniture-sized stereos obsolete. A grandchild would likely mistake it for a sideboard or a TV stand, and never think to lift the lid and find a record player hiding inside. Here's a small square of paper covered in tiny purple print, handed out warm, with a distinctive sharp smell that made kids lift it to their faces. That's the Ditto worksheet, run off on a spirit duplicator in schools before cheap photocopying. The teacher cranked a drum machine that pressed purple ink from a master sheet onto page after page, and the copies came off slightly damp and fragrant. You'd feel the warm sheet come down the row and catch that solvent smell. Photocopiers replaced the whole process. A grandchild handed a crisp laser printout would never know that classroom copies once arrived in soft purple ink, warm from the machine and famous for their smell. Stay up late enough, and something strange used to happen. Television itself would end for the night. First, the national anthem played, then a circular pattern with a drawing of a headdress filled the screen, and after that, nothing but hissing snow until morning. That's the Indian head test pattern and the old sign-off ritual. In the 1950s and 60s, stations didn't broadcast around the clock. When programming ended, they played the anthem, put up a test pattern that helped calibrate the picture, and went silent for the night. Picture falling asleep on the couch with the set still on, and waking to a screen full of static, the surest proof you'd made it to the very end of the broadcast day. 24-hour programming, then cable, then endless streaming, ended it. This may be the hardest of all for a grandchild to grasp, because to them, television and everything else simply never stops. None of these objects became strange because they were badly made. They became strange because the world around them changed so completely that the routines vanished with them. The dial, the tape, the map, the checkbook, each made perfect sense in its moment, and now needs explaining to the very people you love most. The objects slipped out of daily life, but the memories attached to them stayed right where they were. So, how many could you identify before the reveal? And which one do you think your grandchildren would find the most baffling? Leave it below, and if this made you smile, consider subscribing for the next trip through the everyday path.